The same thing took place in Japan and the Far East, and they also have good records of the kind of climate change that took place. So here I look particularly at Nikko, a set of shrines and temples north of Tokyo. Now, the records from these temples show a very interesting pattern. They record the kinds of damage that takes place to the buildings over long periods of time. And we see there seems to be a decline in the earthquake damage and an increase in the damage from floods. Now, how can that come about? Why would the frequency of earthquakes change? Well, it's really about the way in which they managed to build structures over time that became more resistant to earthquakes. So it wasn't so much that the earthquakes lessened, it really was that the earthquakes faced a more resilient set of built structures, so the damage was much less. By contrast, floods, they may have increased, but the temples probably became, over time, built in places where flooding was more severe, so the damage was more noted by the monks who kept the records. So we have to be very careful in attributing everything to climate change. In this example, it appears as though other features, the way in which the temple responded to threats, that actually changed the frequency of those threats. We can also look to the south of Asia and go to Southeast Asia, where in the 15th century there were big changes underway, and what we see here is under the Thai king at the time, poetry, for example, became more realistic. It described the real world. So if you take poems like the Tawad Tosamad Klong Dan, you can notice and count the number of events. For example, you can count the number of floods recorded in this poem through the year. And what you find is the times of flood, those arrows on the little diagram, agree very well with the modern seasonal times of flood. And when thunder and lightning is described, you can see that the little arrows describing the times of thunderstorms agrees well with the modern period. So it wouldn't appear from these records that the climate of Southeast Asia changed so much from the 15th century through to the present time. However, these were times of great unrest in northern China, so Chinese pottery became less available to Southeast Asia. So this region of Thailand took over the manufacture of large amounts of ceramics for the region, and this meant that it increasingly needed to produce large amounts of pottery and export that throughout Asia. So they needed huge numbers of kilns. These kilns were extremely large, burnt major quantities of wood, and ultimately produced very large quantities of smoke. And the Thai authorities at the time were very thoughtful about the way they regulated things. So what they did is they made sure that the particular kilns that they constructed, often as many as 100 were operating at a given time, these kilns lay to the north of the city of Sisachanalai. And as you'll see from the windrows, this meant that the winds, which predominantly came from the south, drove all the smoke and pollution away. So it was an effective way of trying to control the smoke pollution from the kilns. So here we see societies responding to particular weather properties and trying to improve the way that the environment of the city was expressed.